One day, a special customer walked into a luxury restaurant in the US, Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend. However, a young waitress turned him away for not meeting the dress code. What seemed like a simple misunderstanding quickly escalated when Shaq accidentally spilled water on her dress, and she angrily told him to leave. But then, a shocking truth was revealed. Stay tuned for the full story. It was late afternoon in Beverly Hills, and the last rays of the sun cast a golden glow over the glamorous street. The upscale restaurants in the area were always buzzing with wealthy guests, successful businesspeople, celebrities, and those living a lavish lifestyle. One restaurant stood out, its gleaming glass doors and elegant leather chairs awaiting patrons for dinner. From a black SUV parked nearby, Shaquille O'Neal, the world-renowned basketball star, stepped out. Towering over 2 meters tall, he caught the eye of several passers-by. But instead of donning a sharp suit or fancy attire, Shaq wore a loose gray t-shirt, comfortable sweatpants, and simple sneakers. He was just looking for a quiet, low-key dinner. As he entered, Shaq noticed a few curious glances from some guests, but he paid them no mind. The glass door shut behind him, separating the outside noise from the calm, upscale atmosphere inside. Jessica, a young waitress, hurried over to him. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back, and her sharp gaze scrutinized him. This was a high-end restaurant where guests were expected to dress well, and seeing Shaq's simple attire, she couldn't hide her surprise and discomfort. She gave him a stiff smile, her tone flat. "Hello, this is a high-end restaurant. We have a dress code. If you haven't made a reservation, I'm afraid." Shaq gently interrupted. "I just need a table for one." Jessica hesitated, scanning his sneakers up to his calm face. Despite feeling uncomfortable, she tried to stay professional. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any tables available." Shaq shrugged, showing no signs of irritation. He looked around the clearly empty space, with several tables still unoccupied. "Really? It looks like there are plenty of seats." Jessica stood her ground. "Those tables have already been reserved." Just then, a well-dressed man entered through the back door, and Jessica immediately greeted him warmly, escorting him to a table by the window. Shaq observed quietly, his smile fading slightly. Jessica felt a little embarrassed, noticing Shaq's gaze. "You can wait a moment," she offered, trying to ease the situation. "I'll check if any reservations were canceled." Shaq nodded calmly. "I'll wait." But just a few minutes later, she returned with the same cold tone. "Sorry, no tables are available." Nearby customers began noticing the situation, some curious about the tall, calm man standing in the middle of the restaurant. Shaq sighed quietly, still watching Jessica as she served other guests. But rather than getting upset, he simply stood there, as though waiting to see how far this would go. The once serene atmosphere in the restaurant now felt tense, with some guests staring. Though they hadn't realized who Shaq was yet, they saw the imposing figure standing still, unmoving. Meanwhile, Jessica carried on, seemingly unfazed by the man in front of her. In her mind, she was simply following the rules, but Shaq's towering presence was undeniable. A manager named Mark emerged from the kitchen and glanced at Shaq briefly before turning to Jessica. "What's going on? Why is he still standing there?" Jessica lowered her voice but kept her stern expression. "Just a customer who doesn't meet the dress code. I told him we don't have any available tables." Mark furrowed his brow, eyeing Shaq again. His face looked oddly familiar, but he couldn't quite place him. "Let me handle this," Mark said, walking toward Shaq. "Sorry, sir, but as Jessica mentioned, we're fully booked at the moment." Shaq raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp but still polite. "Are you sure about that? I can see several empty tables over there." Mark hesitated but stood firm. "We have to keep those reserved for customers who have booked in advance." Shaq nodded slowly and stepped closer, his voice deep but clear. "So, I guess I'm not important enough to have a seat here, right?" The question made both Mark and Jessica pause. Several nearby guests began to sense the tension, and Jessica began to feel uncomfortable. But her pride and stubbornness kept her from changing her stance. "We treat all customers fairly," she interjected. "And the dress code is non-negotiable." Shaq chuckled lightly, not a cheerful laugh, but one that suggested he had just heard something unbelievable. Crossing his arms, he took a step back. Fair, huh? All right, go ahead, do it your way. But instead of leaving, Shaq stood his ground, waiting to see who would change their attitude first. His calmness only made the situation more awkward. As whispers spread throughout the restaurant, a few guests began to recognize the towering man. Is that Big Shaq? Oh my God, he looks so different without a suit. That's Shaquille O'Neal. Mark began to realize the gravity of the situation, but Jessica still refused to change her attitude, growing frustrated with the increasing attention from other guests. Shaq stepped closer again, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. You should know that respect isn't something reserved for the well-dressed. It's something that should be given to everyone. The room fell into tense silence. Jessica's face flushed, but her pride kept her from admitting her mistake. Mark quickly stepped in, trying to ease the tension. Mr. Shaquille, I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. We'll arrange a table for you right away. Jessica opened her mouth to protest, but Mark shot her a warning glance. We'll talk about this later. Shaq smiled gently, but without the same ease as before. No need for that, but thank you. As he walked to the table Mark had prepared, the other guests watched in astonishment and murmured amongst themselves. Shaq sat at a leather chair by the window, and Jessica, despite trying to maintain composure, couldn't hide her discomfort. When Shaq opened the menu, Jessica approached with a cold expression, trying to regain control. Now that you're seated, I hope you'll abide by the other house rules, she said, her tone emphasizing Shaq was being favored against her will. Shaq set down the menu and smiled knowingly. I always respect the rules. But maybe the rules need to come with respect for others, don't you think? Jessica, her cheeks red with embarrassment and frustration, turned to leave. But then, Shaq accidentally spilled water all over her black skirt. The water spread quickly, soaking the hem of her dress. She froze, breathing quickly, her eyes narrowing with anger. Some guests gasped in shock, waiting for what would happen next. What are you doing? Jessica nearly shouted, losing her composure. This is a high-end restaurant, not a place for such antics. Shaq shrugged, remaining calm. Sorry, it was an accident. I'll take responsibility. But the apology did nothing to calm Jessica's fury. She pointed at him firmly. I think it's time for you to leave. Someone like you doesn't belong here. Mark hurried over to intervene, but Shaq gently raised a hand to signal him to stop. Standing tall, Shaq looked at Jessica with calm, powerful eyes. Are you sure about that? Jessica glared at him, standing firm. Absolutely. I have the right to refuse service to anyone who disrespects this restaurant. Shaq stepped closer, lowering his voice. Interesting, because I'm the owner of this restaurant. The room seemed to freeze. Whispers immediately stopped. Jessica's face stiffened in disbelief, and she was left speechless. Mark turned to Shaq, now recognizing him. Mr. O'Neal. Shaq nodded. I bought this place a few weeks ago. I'm here to check how it's running today. Jessica's face burned with embarrassment, her whole body freezing at the revelation. Her arrogance suddenly seemed absurd. Shaq chuckled softly. I wasn't planning to make a scene, but it looks like there are a few lessons to be learned today, right? The restaurant fell into heavy silence. Jessica stood still, her mind blank as Shaq's words echoed in her head. I'm the owner of this restaurant. Mark, swallowing nervously, bowed his head. Mr. O'Neal, I apologize for this incident. We'll take care of it right away. Shaq waved his hand, signaling Mark to stop. I don't need excuses. What I want is respect for all customers, no matter what they wear or who they are. Turning to Jessica, his gaze sharp but compassionate, Shaq asked, Do you know what the most important thing in the service industry is? Jessica bit her lip, her hands nervously clutching the hem of her skirt, struggling to find words. The humiliation felt like a tight knot in her throat. It's respect and humility, Shaq continued. Whether someone's a businessman in a suit or someone dressed casually like me, they all deserve to be served equally. Jessica lowered her gaze, unable to meet Shaq's eyes. She could feel the stares of the other guests, reminding her of the arrogance she had just displayed. Mark stepped in, trying to ease the tension. "Jessica, I think you should apologize to Mr. O'Neal." Jessica took a deep breath, her voice small but clear. "Mr. O'Neal, I apologize for my unprofessional behavior. I didn't understand my role and didn't show respect for you or the most important rule in this industry." Shaq nodded, his expression softening. Accepting an apology is easy, but changing yourself is the hard part. "I hope today will be a lesson for you." Jessica lowered her head, knowing there was nothing left to justify. Shaq returned to his table and continued his meal, as if nothing had happened. The guests slowly resumed their conversations, but the story of the basketball legend and the unexpected incident remained the main topic. Jessica realized her mistake and learned the value of humility. She understood that every customer had their own story, and her job was to respect that, not judge them. Later, Mark approached Shaq with an apologetic smile. "Thank you for handling the situation so gracefully. We'll retrain the team so this never happens again." Shaq simply smiled. Everyone needs a little time to learn. What matters is knowing how to change when needed. By the end of the evening, Shaq left the restaurant, not just leaving behind a lesson in respect, but also the mark of a great man, both on the basketball court and in everyday life.